right, ladies, gentlemen, welcome to day one of Tales of the Cocktail. I think it's so hard to tell because this is the first time we've ever done anything on a Monday, but feels great to be here and great to be back and wonderful to be back in New Orleans. So thank you to all of you for taking time out of extremely busy and slightly compressed schedule here at Tales. So thank you for choosing to spend the afternoon with us and travel back in time a little bit over the last 20 years or so, and also use that historical retrospective about the impact of Tales and the trends that we have seen over the last 2 decades, and potentially forecast through our slightly hazy crystal balls about what might be coming next and what do we feel are the trends that will define and drive the industry over the next decade or so. So we'll do our best. Now, we should point out here, we've got an all-star panel who I'll introduce in a moment, but I see a few of you with notepads out, and we should clarify that much like they used to joke about the 60s, nothing we say will necessarily be biblically true, because if you remember the last 20 years, if you say you remember the last 20 years of the industry, then you probably weren't there. So some of our recollections we've tried to sort of put in our best guess about where this trend started to build and started to tip. So as Winston Churchill, among others, used to say, those who don't know their history are doomed to repeat it. And so we thought it would be an interesting moment at the 20th year retrospective of Tales of the Cocktail to look backwards and to ask ourselves what have been the defining moments and what's been the progress, really, of the industry over the last 20 years, both in the United States and in New Orleans, and also the impact that Tales has around the whole world as well, around the globe. And really to sort of check the progress and the distance that we have managed to come. But before we get into that, just want to do a couple of thank yous. So first of all, a massive thank you to the Tales of the Cocktail team, right from the level of directors such as Claire Warner. It's really amazing to think, the last 2.5 years have been so full of road bumps for so many of us, but particularly for those people in the events industry. So it's really fantastic to have the opportunity to be back in a city we all love so much. And I want to pay credit to the team at Tales, all the way through from the event team, the leadership, all the way through to the back of house team who are preparing your cocktails. The execution that Tales does year after year after year is fantastic, and after that hiatus. So it's great to be back. So thank you to everyone from our Tales team. And also, much like the Tales team, Tales of the Cocktail would not be possible without our sponsors. So thank you very much to Bombay Sapphire for sponsoring this seminar. In particular, when we introduced the panelists, you realize why it's particularly excellent for me that Bombay Sapphire wanted to sponsor this versus any other brand. All right, so let's talk a little bit about, before we do that, I'll introduce our panel because obviously they're all sitting here. I think they're extremely famous personalities in the industry, and so I should give them the opportunity to introduce themselves, I think. So first of all, I guess we should start probably with the youngest member of our panel. Each of these people on our panel also play a really critical role, not just in the industry itself, in terms of taking trends across the United States and around the world, but they're also central to the Tales organization through the work that they do in terms of helping push forward the awards, various of the committees, and really just making Tales a better organization. So, Charlotte, introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your first Tales.
Thank you, Jacob. Hi, everyone.
Hi.
So, very excited to be back at Tales of the Cocktail. My first Tales was in 2006. Tony Abu-Ghanim suggested I come down to New Orleans and check it out. It was tiny back then, kind of everyone was in the same room for every event, but it was wonderful. Next time I came back, we did a whole lot more. That was my first Tales. My favorite Tales, if I may, was probably when this picture was taken. The only time I've been on a private jet in my life. But before this picture was taken, I'd just been at the World War II Museum milking a cow to make myself the world's freshest Ramos Gin Fizz, which was, right? I have to give props to... Never to be repeated. I have to give props to Jim Ryan for coming up with that idea, but it was indicative of the kind of you can do anything at Tales spirit that I think we've all enjoyed over the years. So thanks for having me on the panel.
Fantastic. Now, our next panelist is Colin Asari-Appiah, who is one of my colleagues at Bacardi. But Colin, I should let you introduce yourself, and then if necessary, I'll embellish your CV.
It's either Colin Asari-Appiah or Mr. Get Involved, bruv. But no, one of my favourite times at Tales, apart from the first time I came, which was in 2006 as well, was when I won Best Brand Ambassador, which was amazing. That was in 2016. I think I'd been nominated for it every year prior, and I'd always been the bridegroom and never the bride. And now I won that year. And I was literally in mid-bite when my name got called, and the camera was on me. Everyone shot up at my table, and I just looked around like, what's going on? And they're like, you've won. And I said, oh, wow, this is amazing. But another time, another great moment, and we've had a few great Tales moments, was when we did a spirited tribute to a wonderful cocktail bartender, Tom Bullock, who wrote The Ideal Bartender. This was in 2012. And it was one of the most attended spirited dinners at that time, which was an amazing achievement for Tales at the time that it had grown to that stage. Because when we started, it was really small, and there were thousands of people in the room. And yeah, that's my Tales moments, and I'm going to share more with you as we go through this conversation.
Awesome. Now, right. Colin's also downplaying his CV here a little bit as well, but you talk about Tom Bullock, who we think was probably the last black bartender to write a cocktail book during the 20th century. So Colin has actually just published his own cocktail book, which is called Black Mixcellence.
Shameless plug. Thank you, Jacob.
Yeah. Now,
available downstairs.
I think probably most people on the stage probably are sort of either in the midst of or thinking about a cocktail book. I think Charlotte would probably write one, but she's too busy. I would write one, but nobody would read it. And Simon would write one, but nobody would print it. But Colin has actually gone and done it. So if you get the opportunity this week, I urge you to buy Colin's book and get him to sign it.
Yeah, please do. Yeah. We're doing a book signing 11:30, 12:30 on Wednesday downstairs.
Fantastic. All right, Simon. Now, it probably needs no introduction either.
I just want to say, you just turned it into like a chat show. I'm going to plug my book. You know? Well, I've got a movie coming out. No, I'm Simon Ford. Woo! Yeah, I work on this gin brand called Ford's. My first Tales of the Cocktail was the second one, whatever year that was, I've forgotten, but it was the very second one. It was actually, there was nothing really going on, a few meals, a few conversations. I helped build the Museum of the American Cocktail that year. It was in the old Pharmacy Museum, and Ted Haim was there, and we were putting cabinets together and putting all these artifacts in. So that was kind of like when I saw it, and I have to say that I'm like, this needs a party. This event is good, but there's all this talking about cocktails and having like nice dinners. It needs a proper party. And so that fast forward to one of my favorite moments, which is 2006, when we threw one of the first proper parties at Tales of the Cocktail. We had a New Orleans funeral. We buried the Appletini that year. Yep, very important thing to do. I did, yeah, the lawyers from Apple Pucker did send a note, and going back, but we did that, and then we had this funeral procession, everyone dancing down the streets, ended up in this giant party, which everything that could go wrong did, because we weren't prepared for it. You know, we prepared for 200 people, 400 people came, I think it was. Then the next year, we prepared for 400 people, and about 800 people turned up. So I'm assuming that every party, my only advice is get there early right now, because I'm going to assume there's 2,000-3,000 people turning up this year to the events. But that was my favorite, the first party.
Fantastic. So, and then of course Simon also played a central role together with Charlotte in turning the Spirited Awards into something which really made Tales a destination as well. So I think back then we used to call it the Simon Ford Show, right? It was like, back before people had podcasts, he had his own award show. So all right, so I think Charlotte, you were 2006 for Tales, Simon even earlier, Colin I think 2007. So I'm originally from New Zealand, so my first Tales was 2008 because it takes a long time for news to reach the Southern Hemisphere. But I eventually heard about this amazing festival and convinced my boss that I should jump on a plane in the middle of a New Zealand winter and fly directly to Tails. And the very first person I saw when I got out of the taxi was Dale DeGroff, who handed me a drink because he was halfway through it and he was heading back to his hotels. He was like, "Here, take my cocktail." And I think that was, really an indication of the kind of madcap energy of Tales of the Cocktail, the opportunity to meet people who were, that you'd looked up to and wanted to have a chance to engage with, and of course the chance to be in this really incredible city where anything went. So I'm the Global Advocacy Director for Bacardi and a blue drinks enthusiast, but don't worry, there's no blue drinks being served in the filming of this seminar. And you can follow me on Instagram at Jacob Briers. All right, so let's get into things and talk about what are the trends over the last few years. We have come a long way in 20 years. So back in 2002, things felt very, very different. So almost everyone around the world, the way they engaged with cocktail flavors was through an RTD. So there wasn't a lot of premium spirits. The biggest movie in the country was Spider-Man. In the music world, a lot of artists were dropping cognac names into their hip-hop songs, and a lot of people were talking about R. Kelly. And so...
Too soon.
So now we get to 2022, of course, and a lot of things have changed as well. What we're going to try and do over the next sort of hour is try and put together what we think have been some of the central trends that have been, where the Tales has influenced the industry, where the industry and even society has influenced Tales, and some of the things that felt really important at the time but have disappeared, and then other things through the course of the last 20 years that felt very, very central and are going to continue to be so. So this is very much, sorry.
I have a question, because you work for Bacardi.
Yeah.
Bacardi breezes no longer exist, right?
Well, we're probably, at the rate RTDs are growing, we're probably frantically trying to bring them back.
Well, all I was going to say is to everyone in this room who's contributed to cocktail culture, you helped kill this brand.
Yeah.
I thank you all.
Yeah. On behalf of the shareholders of Bacardi, we don't thank you. Amazing. We made a lot of money in selling these to your parents. All right, so let's talk just very, very quickly about some of the central things. We're going to try and illustrate each of these trends as well with a little bit of data, and talk about where the industry has come. But probably the seminal thing that feels really important to me is all the work that everybody, Tales of the Cocktail, over the last 20 years, everyone on this stage and all of you who are bartenders, spirits industry professionals in this room, the biggest indication, I think, of the scale and how far we've moved is that total spirit sales in the United States have increased by 85% from 2002. So effectively, and then within the on-premise or the on-trade, the bars and restaurants that so many of you work in, they've doubled. So 103% increase, which is absolutely phenomenal. So in that time, spirits have become more popular in terms of the amount of money that people want to spend on them than wine or beer, right? Which is a really, really central cultural shift, I think, in terms of the popularity. So every single one of you has played a massive part in that. And right now today, of course, spirits and cocktails feel extremely central to the experience that people are having in your bars and restaurants. But it wasn't all that way. So let's talk about 2002, right? I think things were very, very different then. Cool. So 2002, we kind of think about this as the start of a global era. You'll see Sasha Petrosky here on screen, who was perhaps one of the most influential figures in the industry, and whom we're paying tribute to this evening if you have the time. But I would probably say he opened his first bar, I think, 1999 in New York City, Milk and Honey.
New Year's Eve, right?
What's that? New Year's Eve, yeah. But I would probably say one of the central moments in kind of his influence in the industry was when he opened his first bar outside of the United States. So in 2002, Milk and Honey opened in London, and I think that was a really central moment in the growing maturity of the entire industry, because we've got 4 foreigners here on stage, so it's as easy for us to say. But in 2002, the center of the drinks industry was not the United States. Would that be fair?
We actually came across... Oh, do you want to go first?
No, go ahead.
We came across Colin and I in 2002 with a whole crew of London bartenders to launch a gin brand that isn't sponsored here today. And all of the drinks back in London at the time were like muddled raspberries, mint, and all these syrups. And he worked at a bar called The Lab that was doing lots of vanilla sugar. And we came across, and we threw these parties, and they were big budget events, lots of media and so on. And it was quite funny because the drinks in the United States are very strong and spirituous, and here we were with these things that look like smoothies, essentially. And so the saying that sort of came up for us was like, oh my gosh, it's a fruit salad. Like that was how people were perceiving the drinks. The two styles were very different. What Sasha was doing was very different to what London was doing.
Yeah, it was very spirituous cocktails back then. And in London and the UK, we were using the basis of cocktail classics, but we were using all the ingredients out of the chef's pantry, which was a massive difference. So yeah, we did get lots of fruity cocktails. It was Jamie Oliver's fault, actually, that we actually started using vanilla sugar in all of our cocktails at the lab.
So I think, in the United States, cocktails were extremely central to kind of the way in which people go out. So, the idea of happy hour, there was always a cocktail menu, but it was really the same, like 10 drinks, right, on every single menu. So what really started to happen in the early 2000s, where you had this idea of America's formula of classic cocktails paired with British inventiveness, which was this idea that you could just keep flipping the script, reinventing all of these cocktails, and it really created a bit of excitement and enthusiasm, which leads us to 2003, the British invasion of the entire world, which... Now, unusually for the drinks industry, I think, like most of the consumption and most of the history is in the United States, but in the early 2000s, most of the large liquor companies were actually headquartered in London. And that's where most of the marketing and advertising happened. And so these guys decided, hey, if we want to grow our spirits and grow our brands, the best place to do this is the United States. But they don't seem to have any cocktail celebrities here, so let's send some of ours. Right, so they started to send across a whole lot of very, very famous people from UK bars and send them across to the United States.
What you just said there, Jacob, is that it's England's fault that the brand ambassador exists.
It's your fault.
Well, in that case, yes, we'll get to that in just a second. But just in front of you, I think was probably one of the first and most influential modern cocktails, which is the Bramble from the late Dick Bradsell, which is really just takes a very, very simple formula that America knew well, which is the sour, and puts gin in it, which is something America at that point did not do, and then throws in this idea that Simon was talking about, which is the fresh fruit infusion. So a really delicious drink, Bombay Sapphire, fresh lemon, simple syrup, just a classic sour formula, and then a little bit of creme de mure, which at this point, and possibly even still today, was something you couldn't really very easily find here. So, all right, so Simon, you make a good point.
Wow, that's a blast from the past.
Yeah.
Blue steel.
So now we get to the age of the ambassador. I'll probably get all of you. Charlotte, do you want to kick off this? Because I know you were you were first working on the bar side, and ambassadors started to come in and harass you. But let's talk about like the impact of ambassadors on the industry.
Yeah, for sure. And when I opened my bar in London, Apartment 195 in 2002, and it was definitely the time when ambassadors would come in, and I remember Claire, back in the day, would come in and teach us all about Belvedere. But it was like the first brand ambassadors would come in, and it was education, and it was fun, and that hadn't really happened before. And fast forward, when I moved to the US in 2006 as a brand ambassador, and Simon helped me a lot, kind of introducing me to people, explaining to me. And it was basically like, just do what we did in London a few years ago, because that's basically what we need to do. But it's true. So we'd kind of just been through it in London, in the UK, education, cocktail competitions, build a culture, blah, blah, blah. And let's just do that only on a larger scale in the US. And that's kind of what we did. And I think that's one of the reasons why a lot of people did come over from the UK and kind of know what it would take to get this thing moving, right?
Yeah, definitely. It's also, it was the age of global brand ambassadors as well.
Yeah.
The gentleman with the hat, Dimitri Lazinska, on your right, I believe, he was my co-presenter in the Cocktail Kings. And in this show, he was actually at the time he was the global brand ambassador for Grey Goose Vodka. And so he'll travel around the world first class. He'll definitely travel.
Vodka money.
Yeah. Vodka pay the bills. And he would wear all these amazing suits, and obviously Joe McCanter took over after and carried on the tradition.
Definitely carried on wearing the great suits, that's for sure.
Exactly. But what happened with that was bartenders saw a progression for them in the industry, and being a brand ambassador was one of those things that they could actually do in their careers, because you do get to a point in your career and you think, where shall I go, what shall I do? And brand ambassador definitely became one of those things.
So this TV show, The Cocktail Kings, I do think it's worth mentioning it, because Colin and Dimmy create this TV show, and they go into different parts of the world. They pick ingredients. They go on television. It was really ahead of its time, and then they would compete in the studio against each other, and it really was good. And if you can find it on YouTube or anything, it's worth watching. But I do remember I was in a small village in Nicaragua, and the entire they would come in and they would watch the Cocktail King. So I had to get him on the phone at 3 a.m. because he was famous in Nicaragua.
And I jumped on, and you got the tab for free, right?
Exactly. And that's hospitality for you.
So I think the other thing as well, it's certainly easy for me to kind of be aware of, because I was sort of in New Zealand at this point, at very much the last stop on the global subway tour, if you like, in terms of access to knowledge. And this group of global and local national brand ambassadors were taking information and knowledge, and they would take a trend that they would see in one city, and they would jump on a plane and go to the next place and effectively distribute. There's a brand new drink that I've just seen. There's a brand new way of doing this cocktail. There's a new way of shaking this, and those sorts of things. And they really started to knit the industry together, and it made the global industry feel like a small village for the very first time, rather than we were doing something crazy in this kind of market and nobody really knew about it. And I think it was a really big effect that Tails has also helped amplify, making the global industry feel much smaller. And it also leads us on to a mega trend that I think Tails, perhaps better than any other, indicates, which is that education is the key to growth. And I think you can certainly see that in terms of the numbers, in terms of the size of the industry, the doubling in the amount that people are prepared to spend. But also, I think, education leads to appreciation, and this is something I think we'd all fully believe in.
Yeah, I think Tails has always been about the seminars, right? And the parties, Simon.
Yeah.
But it's always kind of revolved around the seminars. It's been such a key part. And if you go back and look at the seminar titles year on year on year, you can see exactly what the trends were, right? And of course, the mass trends weren't what people were talking about at that moment. They were the things that would become the trends in 3, 4, 5, 8 years' time, in the case of New Zealand. But it's interesting if you it was your joke, so it's okay to use it back at you. But you can see the
recycling is a trend too when we talk about sustainability.
You can see what people were talking about, and then maybe how long it would take to come into effect. And I think your point about knitting the global cocktail community together, apart from certain individuals doing that around the world in their global ambassador roles, Tails really helped bring that together. Because as we were just discussing, like the first time I came to Tails, like Facebook wasn't even a thing. This wasn't all on social media. Younger than you.
The Facebook.
The Facebook wasn't a thing. But there wasn't like instant social media. You weren't seeing people's menus all over the world and then instantly copying them. It took, get into New Orleans, of all places, of all charming places, and then flying back to where you sort of your bar is and thinking, right, I'm going to implement what I just learned in Louisiana back in Singapore or London or wherever. So I think Tails had a massive role to play in that time, right? Maybe social media has kind of taken it and run with it now, but in those early 2000s, Tails had a big part to do with that.
There was a moment when it did get a bit silly. Everyone was trying to come up with ideas for seminars, though, and now it's back on track. It'd be like the science of sugar syrup or the history of like grenadine from the 70s or whatever. It was, but sorry.
That's my seminar tomorrow.
Yeah.
So.
I thought it was the egg seminar, no?
That was last year.
But you can certainly see this both in the boon of the categories as well. So categories that feel like they've exploded, or particular spirits that people are a lot more in love with now than they were, say, 20 years ago. I mean, tequila and mezcal being the obvious examples. You can walk backwards through the last 20 years and work out what have been the steps that people have taken to make those particular brands and spirits generate so much excitement. And education and spreading knowledge is almost always one of the key steps that people take in order to make things much more popular. Then likewise, if you're in a small town, right, or a smaller market, as people like to say, and you think, we will never have the opportunity to make drinks in the way they do in New York, Singapore, or London. So again, so often you can build a base through education in terms of making your guests much more open to trying new things, making them willing to spend more, and developing the cocktail culture. So education to me has felt like the central thread, which when we look back over the last 20 years and this doubling of spirits consumption to the exclusion of wine and beer, education has felt like it's the key driver.
And moving people to quality rather than, the quality of spirits and the entry-level spirits that come into the world now all need to be great because of this education.
Mm-hmm. Great. All right. So let's lead on to the next kind of key trend, I think. And we put this around 2005, but this could really be anywhere in the early 2000s. So, but at this point, you had you had Colin and Dimmy on television, but otherwise, when you turned on the television, it was primarily chefs, many of whom's reputations have not stood the test of time. But in the early 2000s, many of these chefs had TV shows, and food became something very, very elevated. There were foodie subcultures, and so a few bartenders started to say, well, we need to get the same respect for the craft of cocktails and for mixology that chefs enjoy if we're ever going to be able to grow and get media attention. And I think probably the first of these was Audrey Saunders, who actually had been a chef and who knew how to talk that chefy language. And I think this is a really seminal point at which people started to talk about cocktails as culinary creations.
I think this part can't be understated too much, because the habits of most people going out for a drink at this time were to get a beer. I don't know, it was probably $4 at the time, to drink shots, maybe, spirit and mixer. And so now to try and get someone to change their habits and spend $12 on something, and if you remember in those days, you would wait for a drink, because one of the trends was, one hand behind the bar, behind your back, stir your martini and really milk the moment, right? This was the bartender's moment, until some other bartenders went, we need to speed this up. But, but there was this moment when it was, changing someone's habit to spend $12 on a drink was actually very difficult. And people would come into the bar, and if that drink didn't taste good, then they would go back to their spirit mix or their beer. And so it's the bartenders of this period that really are actually kind of pioneering that, moment for the entire industry. That it was hard work. Half their customers don't understand cocktails and cocktail culture.
It was also a lot about demanding the respect, right, that cocktails deserved. I remember early on, it wasn't Tales, but it was another event for consumers, and Dale was preparing cocktails, and I think someone brought out, a bunch of white wine glasses for his drink. And, Dale's the easiest going, most kind, gentleman you'll meet, but he was like, absolutely not. This is a cocktail, it goes in a cocktail glass. Until we get that message through, this whole thing is never going to change. So it was also the likes of Audrey and Dale and others in this moment demanding the respect on behalf of the cocktail. I think that helped move the needle.
Cool. So then we move on, I think, to 2006, and this is really a rise of mixologists that are starting to look backwards in time. Audrey obviously opening Pegu Club, which was such a gin-focused event. We get to kind of 2006, which is, I think, the new gin craze. This is a picture, I think, Simon, of you. And this point could actually be, and it's interesting to think about, because if you think about the early 2000s, vodka was the preeminent spirit of choice. That's what we used for cocktails. The margarita, of course, was the most popular drink, so there was always tequila. But really, vodka and whiskey were the two kind of things. And then suddenly gin came in and crashed the party. And I think, probably Simon and Charlotte, you probably deserve a large amount of the credit for that.
Yeah.
So it is an interesting moment. Again, something not to take for granted is that I thought that every menu was 9 vodkas, flavored, and then 1 to make you kind of look quite good, and then all of a sudden, whiskey is coming back. The margarita would obviously be a staple, and so coming and trying to sell gin into a world of essentially flavored vodka wasn't easy. I would walk into bars and it would be no, 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 and no constantly. I'd just walk around with this bottle of gin, and it's very interesting because I think the first 2 people that said, "Oh, someone that likes gin," was Audrey Saunders and Julie Reiner. And I went into the Flatiron Lounge when it was still a building site, and some guy ahead of me was selling these liqueurs, and she promptly carted him out the bar and said, "Be gone with you." And then I'm like there, oh no. And then I have this gin, and she's like, this is amazing. Simon, yep, we're going to work together. And the same, I was, before Julia, I was working with Audrey, and she was at Benwoman's Bar. But there were very few people to talk to. But what was really interesting about being a brand ambassador for gin is the people that wanted to talk to us were the people that cared about the cocktails and cocktail culture. And if you think about gin's connection with cocktails throughout the years, look at any history book. Gin is all over historical cocktail books. So as it was coming back, they were buying these new cocktail books. They were buying old cocktail books again, should I say, and reviving these old recipes and basing it off of these old recipes. And so gin kind of became back because of the synergy between having gin ambassadors at the same time as there are people wanting to revive cocktail culture.
Well, I just want to add that in 2006, I was actually a vodka ambassador.
Yeah, wow.
And nobody at the time wanted to talk to me. So it's interesting coming to Tales, actually. And it was a hotbed of lots of new brands, lots of new ideas and philosophies. And seeing the gin craze coming out of that, I mean, it wasn't too far away from the vodka craze. I mean, what is gin? But, some elegant botanicals put in our vodka. Yeah. But it was amazing. Exactly. I know. As someone who turned up in 2006 at Tales as a vodka ambassador, it was great to see all these new brands and these new spirits and bartenders really excited about what was coming up for the future. And, Tales is still that hotbed for new innovation and for brand ambassadors coming and really educating all of us about what is coming down the line.
And I think, the history of gin and the historical place that gin had a lot to do with that. And I think the other half of the work was introducing gin to a new audience, right? And a certain gin that I worked with that isn't Bombay Sapphire was all about that. It was all about presenting gin in different types of cocktails, right? That might have been more refreshing and using different ingredients like cucumbers. To get the message across, right? But it worked. It opened up the doors, because if you think about it, the gin martini and the gin and tonic, they're acquired tastes, right? They're quite strong tastes, which we've all acquired. I know we don't have to prove that now, but for a new audience, cucumber worked. It worked.
I do have a question on because Colin didn't, it took you how long to win Best Brand Ambassador? I think it's because you had a vodka brand is the reason. I bet you moved to gin and then win it.
You're too funny. I moved to rum actually and won it.
So one thing I should point out as well, just we can actually go back, we can fact check these three by looking at the data. And so one thing I should point out, in spite of the best efforts of Charlotte and Simon and a whole legion of gin ambassadors, gin has not actually grown in the last 20 years at all. It's just been a straight, simple substitution where first Bombay Sapphire came along and bumped out the bottles of Gordon's, and then some other gins came along and bumped out the bottle of Bombay Sapphire, but we'll leave them unknown. Anyway, so gin, over the last 20 years, is a total share of the amount that Americans will spend on spirits. Gin has actually halved its share. So congratulations to both of you. And then Colin, I should also point out, Colin and I were vodka ambassadors in the early 2000s, and vodka has doubled since 2002. So, ladies and gentlemen, Colin Appio.
Thank you.
Okay, but so this age of kind of, I think, the restlessness that happened in the gin category and suddenly triggered a whole lot of excitement was partly about new products. Meeting new products from distillers that wanted to do something really interesting, meeting an audience of people who were really interested to talk about it. And I think those things are critically important. So 2007, all of a sudden, there's a new wave of gins. And what are we drinking at this point? At this point in 2007, everything is a martini, but a proper one, right? Or a martini cocktail. So it's not really as we started drinking, which was something flavored in a martini glass in the late 90s. Instead, these were martini cocktails made properly, and quite often using Audrey's recipe, the 50-50, I think, which was probably the most influential martini riff at that point. So the point about gin, I think, then gets on to this idea that all of a sudden a small number of ambassadors and a small number of enthusiasts, as we have in this room, can light a fire under a particular spirit. And through the time at Tales of the Cocktail, we've seen probably, I guess the first, gin would have been the first spirit that it felt like was creating some momentum. Then all of a sudden, rye whiskey, which was to all intents and purposes extinct, apart from Rittenhouse and Old Overholt, which were kind of, you would see them on the bottom shelf at a dive bar. And then all of a sudden, new people came along, new grains, new enthusiasm for rye, and they would, at Tales of the Cocktail, meet bartenders and writers who wanted to write about something. And then probably, I think the biggest one over the last 10 years has been mezcal, right, which was a spirit that was incredibly overlooked, and then all of a sudden, you had a whole lot of white guys from the Midwest walking around going, hey, do you guys know Stevie Bayo? He's one of my favorite actors. Anyway.
I tell you, it's interesting. You get access to history, and all of a sudden you find out rye's in the Manhattan, and now you can't get rye. It's like this craze, and that's the power of these cocktail books. But I do remember, I was in Mexico, and I meet these guys, Ron Cooper and Steve Olson, and they're heading to Oaxaca for this thing that I'd not heard of at the time. And you sort of, if you think about, going back to gin ambassadors and people aren't really drinking it, now you've got someone that's actually going to bring mezcal. And so all of these trends start in a very small universe, and they expand because of Tales of the Cocktail, and they expand because we all talk to each other all the time. And back then it was through conversation. Now you see more through news and Google and the internet.
Yeah, but Facebook wasn't invented.
Yeah, because seeing mezcal come up, and we, there's only so many things that can actually become trends, and so, Sotol hasn't quite made it yet, but we are having access to all of that, which is unbelievable. It's unbelievable.
And those things didn't happen overnight, right? It was years of bartenders loving mezcal and drinking it before it became a thing, above and beyond our bubble.
Yeah. I think oftentimes, at least prior to Tales of the Cocktail, when there was innovation happening in the spirits industry, it wasn't real innovation, right? It was like, let's make a flavored version of something which is already very popular, and it needs to immediately, we need to find, is there an audience here of 25 million people aged between 21 and 25 that we could potentially sell this to? And so people work backwards from like the end result that they wanted, right? Which is kind of how movies get made today. It's like, can we just make volume 7 of the same characters doing exactly the same thing? And so all of a sudden, Tales is a very overused and kind of cliched business concept called the long tail, which is basically means there's a very small number of a couple of products which prove incredibly popular, but there's actually an amazing market. If a small number of people can find a small number of enthusiasts, you can build a business. And so I think particularly around 2007, we started to see Plymouth Gin, Hendrick's Gin, all of a sudden starting to meet people who were very enthusiastic about gin, rye whiskey. Rob Cooper with Saint Germain all of a sudden brought Saint Germain to Tales of the Cocktail and found enthusiasts that wanted to do a riff on a cocktail that already existed. And so that's really the path to growth that Tales and things like it have unlocked. Find a small number of people who really give a shit about what they're passionate about and sell it to them first, and they will do the job of selling things for you.
I know, and Saint Germain became bartender's ketchup, and it was in every single cocktail. It was crazy, and that was a whole year of just Saint Germain. In every drink, a martini with Saint Germain.
Yep. All right, so then we get into 2007, and this idea of, gin suddenly starts to become very, very backwards looking, and everything, I think, becomes very historical because we have access to the information. And so in 2007, we get this kind of world where everything goes backwards in time. So the rise of, I guess, what we would call now the neo-speakeasies. And it seems like a kind of a short-term fascination when viewed through the 20-year prism, but at the point in 2007, there were only fancy speakeasies being opened. Death and Company, PDT, Violet Hour, and these were hugely imitated all over the world.
And I think you said something to me. If I'd known now what I know then, I would have invested in Tin Roof Company.
Yeah. Yeah, everything had to have a pressed tin ceiling and a Nick and Nora glass.
But this was, these bars really kind of stripped everything else away, and it was just a focus on the drink, right? It was the perfect execution of the cocktail, which at that time hadn't really been appreciated or wasn't at the level it needed to be. So I think this era served that purpose to really showcase the cocktail so people understood detail, the little things that mattered for absolute perfection, and then we see everything else can kind of be put back together again.
Yeah, it layers into that whole idea as well of bartenders viewing themselves in the chef style of creating cocktails and really looking for that respect from the consumer. I know from then to now, the public appreciation, especially after the pandemic when everyone realized they couldn't actually make cocktails and open those bloody bars so that we can get our bartenders to make cocktails. I think this really lent itself to that time where people really focused on their craft, they were serious about their craft, and they really elevated the experience for the guest as well because they were providing these exquisite cocktails in these beautiful surroundings and trying to recreate a moment. I think that gone past.
And it was all about the cues. You had to ease the customer in at the very beginning. Every single speakeasy was playing jazz music because that was the thing that you were supposed to do.
It's hip-hop now.
You know, and you had to have the nice napkin, which is new, right? Well, that's it. It started evolving. All of a sudden, you had to add a bit of irony. You're like, we have a speakeasy, but it plays heavy metal. And, you know, like, and you would go in that, you know, direct, which is a brilliant concept. Exactly. And so it started evolving that now the cues were set. We knew what a speakeasy or a modern speakeasy felt like. And so that now we could start playing with it. And the irony, in fact, this is probably where the beginning of trying to be ironic starts, because you can get the hot dogs, you know, like that high-low thing starts to happen. And from the hot dogs, you can, you know, you've got this, the entry to the speakeasy is now not just a secret door, it's a phone booth, you know. And of course, we've been in the mall. I've been through a wardrobe that's like the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. You come through and there's Narnia, and you've got, you know, I mean, this bar does exist. I've been in a bar that you sit on a bed and then it turns into a slide and you go down into the bar.
Oh, amazing. Where's that?
I know, it's
He can't remember.
Which is good, which means he was there.
Yeah.
But this was brilliant. It meant people, you know, bar owners, and were just starting to have so much fun with the concept that the speakeasy had to be quite serious at the beginning, and now it started evolving into a place where you could have a lot of fun, and that's what was really nice about this moment.
Although a heavy metal speakeasy, I mean, most heavy metal's from the 80s, right? So that's now nearly as retro to 2022 as jazz music was to 2007. So, all right. So I think also these sorts of bars with their own elaborate rituals and their own language, and the bartender there being spotlit, they were kind of almost, you know, quasi-religious rituals for in cities where people no longer went to church, right? So there was a secret language and a secret code and all of these kind of rituals which grew. Another great example of this at the opposite end of the spectrum, from sort of small churches to high cathedrals, was the return of the five-star hotel bar, which I think their reputation had become, five-star hotel bars had seemed very twee and outdated for a very long time. There were sort of places where you meant, you know, people went in Agatha Christie mysteries to get murdered, and then all of a sudden they, you know, in their mid-2000s, people realized that hotel bars could become destinations again. They saw what had happened with the style bars opened by people like Ian Schrager and Ben Pundle, and they realized we could do exactly the same thing using the history. So this is obviously Ago Peroni from the Connaught, which is perhaps, so we chose 2008 here because that's the year that the Connaught reopened after a massive refurbishment. What do you guys, I know, Simon, I know you're a big fan of the hotel bar, and Charlotte, I know you worked on a couple.
I love a hotel bar, and I think it's a really interesting trend to focus on for how it grew, because one of the things that was going on, you have the speakeasies, and they're getting all the attention, right? And that's what people are writing about. They're writing about the drinks, they're writing about Audrey, they're writing about Julie and everybody, and the hotel bartenders were like, hey, hang on a minute. We've been doing this for a long time. And you know, no one, and of course, no one spoke up about this more than Salvatore Calabrese, who said, I've been doing this for a very long time, in a really sexy Italian accent. And so, you know, we were redirected to a place where they, you know, and of course the budgets that hotels have are astronomical, right? They can take it to the level, but don't get me wrong, the cost of their cocktails is also astronomical, right? So it was very much, now you had 3 Michelin star, you know, style of service, which had really always existed, coming back into the forefront. I think what's, you know, the Savoy Hotel, you know, going to the Ritz, Paris, you know, I think you had to pick up the check when we went there last time, and I think that was it. The card didn't work for the rest of the trip.
Yeah.
You know, so you have this moment, but then the Connaught is amazing because that's a reinvention of the hotel bar. It's almost like speakeasies have been reinvented in this moment, but now the hotel bar is modernized. And so this bar has won probably more accolades than any other bar in the world at this point, I'm gonna guess. And every time you go there, it is this level of service that is unbelievable. They bring the trolley out, it's like the tableside carvery, and you get your steak, but now you got the martini version. Everyone there is sharp. I tell you, I could never be there in the white suits. They're rolling Bloody Marys like this. I'm like, I would be like, my dry cleaning bill would be insane if I worked there. But it was all of these rituals, but taken to a level where they can charge you 30 euros for a drink. And so you have to make that really, really special. And they really do. And I think the Connaught is one of the bars that leads that.
And there were a lot of great examples around the Connaught at the time, right? You mentioned the Savoy, the Dorchester, which I worked on back in 2006 when we refurbished that bar. There was so much history and tradition to those places that were harnessed, but then brought to the next level, like you said. And I think that was part of this sort of renaissance. At the Dorchester in particular, it was all about style and substance, right? Big focus on vermouth, which was coming back, all those forgotten classics, but then still that glitz and glamour that they had to provide because they were one of the best, or still are one of the best hotels in the world. So you had that wonderful combination and the resources, like you said, they could afford to do it. Yeah. So, I mean, again, not to say that London was the center of the universe for the second time today, but at this moment with hotel bars, it really was an amazing culture to draw from.
There's a couple in New Orleans that aren't too shabby, though. Yeah, you've got obviously the Carousel Bar has got its history, and classic drinks that come from it, and a spinning bar that if you drink enough, it stays still, and and of course the Sazerac Bar as well, which I know technically isn't an original, but it's still a great example of a fancy hotel bar.
Yep.
Great. All right, we better get moving. So then 2009, we go from sort of speakeasy as a fun and interesting and original concept to peak speakeasy in a very, very kind of short space of time. And the rise and appreciation, I guess, for historicism turned into what I would call like 19th century cosplay. And basically, which is mostly dudes, right? And this was at the point, I think, of what we would say was like the white man takeover of cocktails and hospitality. So everybody dressed like they worked in a 19th century saloon. And we got to this point where I guess the ethos was like old is good, but oldest is best. And so the oldest recipe that you could possibly find for anything became the definitive thing, even if the recipe frankly sucked. Right? And so it was like, well, this recipe is from like 1907 when your recipe is from 1909. So, I mean, case closed, right? It's kind of how every single conversation, including at Tales panels, went. And I think we got to a point of like real ridiculous fetishization of vintage cocktails. So, and then people kind of really kind of leaned into the story. The best story that you could tell about something happening in the 19th century for the invention of this cocktail was all that you needed to do. So you ended up with a lot of kind of slightly dubious stories that people would tell about the invention of drinks, which I think leads us on to...
I was going to say that was also the era of I make my own bitters.
Yeah.
And
not that there's anything wrong with that, Lauren.
No, I mean it's not.
Yeah.
It wasn't that they were doing it. I think it's brilliant that everyone was being creative. It was just the humble brag at the beginning of making you a drink. Yes, this mint came from our rooftop. 4 seconds ago, and I was guilty because we had mint on our rooftop that we would. Yeah. No.
All right, so the Collins is a great example of a story where, this drink had been wildly popular and didn't even really need a story because it's just a simple sour topped with fizz, right? Which is, you can see why it's such a crowd pleaser. But in an era where, people had elaborate stories for the invention of the aviation and we spent hours and hours and hours arguing over what was the original formula for the martini cocktail. The classic cocktails that just taste delicious kind of got a little bit forgotten. So all of a sudden people started to talk about the Tom Collins hoax and kind of, create these really kind of elaborate backward stories that were all about, not really about kind of conveying any joy to the guest necessarily. They were just about proving how old you could possibly make this drink. The older that it was, the better. All right, very, very simple. You've got this here, and the caps behind the scenes have done an amazing job at banging out an extremely refreshing Collins. And now we're slightly behind, which was no surprise with this panel and with me as a moderator, so we're going to crack through slightly more quickly. 2010, I think, is the moment where we reach peak cocktail, in the sense where cocktails really start to tip into the mainstream and it becomes something that your co-workers and your parents know about, right? Rather than this being this very, very kind of small. And I think TV shows played a really important job in that. We should also, by the way, pay credit. Dale DeGroff always likes to joke that it's women who started the cocktail revolution, meaning the 4 women in Sex and the City. But women generally, which we'll get to in a moment, have also played a huge role. But I think you had this kind of building moment where cocktails became a bit of a shorthand for sophistication, for a kind of, making it look like historical eras were really interesting. So in 2008, you had Mad Men, which launched, and everybody, did anyone do any work? They just smoked and drank old fashions, right? And then in 2010, perhaps the most historically accurate show in terms of the representation of cocktails, Boardwalk Empire, started. And it was Ted Haig, the author of Vintage Cocktails, actually consulted on the show and made that every time that they're drinking a drink, that they're drinking it from the right bottle of Bacardi, it's in the right glassware, they're in the right place historically, and it made cocktails cool for people, right? So I think that really played a massive part. So all of a sudden, around 2010, you got this feeling that the cocktail was absolutely everywhere.
And that's when it can take off, right?
Yeah.
Because it's all well and good us talking about it and loving it and getting passionate and geeky, but until the consumer, our guests, public at large, want to take it on, that's when it goes leaps and bounds.
Plus, this show also gave people a good excuse to buy fedoras. Anyone still have a fedora? Anyone remember 2010? Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah. Oh, yeah, fantastic. Congratulations. I loved you in Boardwalk Empire, sir. Yeah. All right. So on to our next point, and I think this is really the historicism of the last couple of years, so 2007 to 2009, meant that the cocktail revival did not always... It was very cool, but there was something missing. And, well, probably the clearest thing that was missing was women. Because every time where you came to a Tales seminar, it was usually 4 old dudes talking about something that had happened in 1863, and which was great. But
we're just 3 old dudes right now, but
You can speak for yourself.
yeah. So, and we put this really in 2011, which was the first speed rack, which I think utterly transformed just the attitude really about, hey, hang on, shouldn't we have some women behind this bar, and shouldn't we have some women on this panel, and all of these sorts of things. So Charlotte, as the only woman on this panel, because we are not very representative up here, which is my fault, maybe you should probably kick off with this one before I offend anyone else.
yeah, well, I think, first of all, Ivy and Lynette have done the most amazing job with
yeah.
Speed Rack. I think the single most impressive thing our industry has produced over the last 10 years for sure. And I remember people sort of saying before Speed Rack, there's no females in the business. I would hire them, but there aren't any. There were plenty. They just weren't noticed, right? And what Speed Rack did is literally built a platform for female bartenders to shine. And there are plenty. They were always there. More and more came, right? And the likes of Lynette and Ivy and Julie and plenty of other strong women have provided mentorship for others to absolutely know that there's no reason they can't do this as well. They've demonstrated career opportunities in the industry. They've done a tremendous job. So I think, Speed Rack just shone a light on what was already there, but it wasn't given the dues it was deserved.
And I think it, again, the very first Speed Rack was a small room in Los Angeles. I think the very first one was the same room in the Roosevelt Hotel there that they did the Oscars. And there was maybe 40, 50 people. And then I think the pinnacle of that was, seeing it in Chicago, or even seeing it here in a theater, and thousands of people cheering and screaming. Have you ever seen anything like that at any other cocktail competition? Maybe the Flair guys back in the day, right? But it's unbelievable. I think my favorite experience was when Haley won it and her mum's in the crowd with all of the signs. I'm just echoing what Charlotte said, the platform that it's provided, but the camaraderie and also the things that they can change as a group together is unbelievable.
Yeah, and it is a true industry effort, right? It's not one brand, it's many brands coming together. Everyone has a role to play in supporting Speed Rack, which I think is another reason it's been so successful.
Yeah, and one of the... Oh, sorry, Colin.
No, I was just going to say, it was really one of the real times that there was a real big community movement to make change in the industry, and everyone got behind it. And that's one thing I love about this industry, that everyone gets involved in community movements, and Speed Rack was definitely one of those, and it kicked off a whole new era for us in the industry to really celebrate women and move the conversation forward.
Great, fantastic. And now when you go into a bar anywhere in the country and you don't see women behind the bar, and it seems very old-fashioned and quite discordant, I think. So that's an amazing thing now, that it seems odd to us and like, oh, this is unusual. You notice that it's wrong, right? So a massive impact. So I'm going to zip through a couple of these quite quickly because we're starting to fall behind. But 2012, so we reached the midpoint of the revival, and off the back of Mad Men, I think probably at 2012, everything is an old-fashioned. And that is all any bartender wants to talk about. Anyone wants to show you their riff on an old-fashioned, and you kind of, I guess it was probably peak old-fashioned bro, right? It was like, a couple of guys that were like, I really like old-fashions. It's like, yeah, you told us. Like, you're still talking about it 2.5 hours later on your third old-fashioned. But I think it really kind of, again, we talk about how speakeasy had stripped everything back to their purest essence. The old-fashioned does that for a cocktail. It removes all of the frippery and just takes it back to a great spirit, slightly improved. And I think that has become a foundation for us. And of course, it was also the era of, a substitution riff. So a mezcal old-fashioned, the brandy old-fashioned obviously was an existing drink. Even a vodka old-fashioned is quite delicious. Gin old-fashioned, I'm yet to be convinced by. All right, then 2012. A couple of big things happened in terms of kind of global excitement and energy. 2010, we get the first London Cocktail Week. So this is a consumer-facing, focused on the general public cocktail show, and that really started to build a lot of momentum and energy in one of the most important cocktail capitals. 2011, we have Tales on Tour, which goes to Vancouver, which was an emerging cocktail destination. Thank you to the Canadian, I think singular, in the audience. Oh, no, I think we've got 2. John is making drinks as well. So, yeah, 3. There we go. So they were allowed across the border. And then from here, Tales starts to go all over the world. So it goes to Buenos Aires, it goes to Puerto Rico, and it really starts to kind of bring this gospel of cocktails. And then every town and city that would like to become a cocktail capital suddenly realizes the best way to do that is to have a cocktail festival or a cocktail week and put themselves on the map. And they really did.
Yeah, and I think this is an important part that Tales played in global cocktail community as well. And not bringing cocktail culture to these cities, absolutely not, but shining a light, right? Sharing the platform. Vancouver, Mexico City, Buenos Aires, Edinburgh. You can see how those bars have, shared in a bit of the spotlight, and it's done wondrous things. And it's also taught the rest of us the best of Canada and Mexico and Argentina and the UK. So it's been a massive help, I think.
All right, I'm going to move forward slowly, sorry. All right, so then we get to what I think is perhaps the seminal mega trend in terms of cocktail growth, which is all of a sudden, I know we've got a couple of espresso martini haters in the room, I can tell, but anyway, the point here is not about the espresso martini, all right? Just don't concentrate on the image. The point here is that we really reached this point post, where cocktails have started to tip into the mainstream, and they are now a very, very kind of central topic of conversation. And we get to a point, I think, where cocktails stop being a drink, something that you drink in order to reach a later destination, like let's have some martinis and get drunk. And instead it becomes cocktails are the entertainment themselves. So let's go out for cocktails. And consumers, the general public, start to talk about where's the best old-fashioned in town, where's the best espresso martini, where is the best Negroni. It becomes a topic of conversation. So cocktails really become an entertainment experience, and I think luckily we're still there. And at this midpoint as well, this is where spirits and cocktail consumption really starts to boom as well. So this is where we're almost like 7, 8, 9, 10% increases every single year. And it makes sense, right? When you walk into a bar, there's a couple of people drinking a beer and there's somebody nursing a Merlot, and then in the middle of the room there's a bartender talking excitedly about cocktails to one of their guests, which seems the most fun thing to drink. And people realize that it was cocktails, and we're still, enjoying that momentum now. All right, 2013, this list should get us on the list. Now, in the first half of this revival, if somebody said, I need to make sure that I'm on the list, they were usually referring about trying to get into one of Charlotte or Simon's parties. And instead, what started to happen is we reach this kind of global focus on like, what's the best bar in town? What's the best bar in the country? What's the best bar in the world? And people suddenly become very aware that they're in a global kind of arms race competition. This menu, I think, was perhaps the most ridiculous and amazing I've ever seen. It even went into space.
They didn't win the sustainability award that year.
All right, so let's talk about the kind of era of 50 best lists and spirited awards, which I know you've all been a big part of.
So 50 Best Restaurants has changed the entire landscape, of restaurants and how people perceive them, in the same as Michelin. And we didn't really have things that celebrated that on an international level in the bar industry. There was certainly the London Bar Awards. I think you won an award. I know that Dan and Claire, everyone won an award over there but me.
That's why he had to move to America.
But in the first Spirited Awards was 2007, and I kind of had pitched the idea to do this, and really at the beginning I just wanted to be a celebration of our industry and certain, and the people that were, making it, important, and the fact that it could then generate press for our industry. And the very first one was a brunch at Harrah's. Harrah's, thanks. Hurrah! Sorry. The English accent coming completely out there, exactly. Sorry. And the first one was 2007, and I'll never forget it. I say I'll never forget it because I was helping organize it and planning. I was actually, the logistics, not the actual awards that year. I wasn't chairman. I was just really sort of making sure everyone was supposed to be making sure everyone got drinks and food. Thankfully, I'm a part of a team. I was late to them. They were a brunch, and I was like, next year this needs to be a dinner. Yeah. So it was like organizing a wedding and having a sort of show together. But of course now it's people will actually create. We'll go on tour, the bar tours. People doing pop-ups and traveling the world and doing guest bartending. All of that sort of tied into this moment where you could sort of essentially be. Didn't need to be an international brand ambassador. Now you could be an international bartender, which was quite brilliant, really, because it's giving people in the industry now an opportunity to see the world and go beyond the four walls of the place that they work, which is to me quite incredible.
Cool. So we start to get this almost, I guess, reaction all of a sudden to the kind of hyper-seriousness of the last maybe 7-8 years. And so we get the beginning of like people wanting to have fun again. So, yeah.
Blue drinks.
Yeah. All right, so this is Jeffrey Morgenthaler, who's probably could almost have his own slide in terms of the trends he's managed to influence. But in 2014, he opened a bar called Pepe Le Moco in Portland, Oregon, which at that point had a cocktail week. And so everybody would go there and kind of go and drink these kind of, and he had I think he calls them orphan cocktails, right? Cocktails from the 70s and 80s that were really bad, although the second one from the left looks awesome to me. Which he would kind of, try and reinvent and make them with better spirits, but the sense that, guests love drinking these silly drinks that were suddenly made properly. And I think this really kicked off a revival for kind of, disco drinks done well.
In many ways, what I felt at the time, this is terrible. Jeffrey will shoot me. No, he wouldn't care. That's what I love about him. Yeah. But we revived everything that we could possibly revive at that point as a drinks industry. And then it was like, oh no, we haven't revived the things that were there when we actually started doing this. Yeah, I remember how to make an amaretto sour from like when I started bartending in like the 90s. I'm gonna do that again, but this time it's gonna come with really fancy liqueurs, and I'm gonna make my own bitters.
Yeah, you didn't bury in any of those cocktails, did you, Simon?
Yeah.
You didn't bury any of those cocktails.
No, I did not.
But we look forward to the Appletini, literally resurrection, I think, rather than
it's
revival.
Coming back.
Yeah.
It's coming back. Thanks, Naren.
All right. We're going to skip through these a little bit quickly. But so you talked about the era of the pop-up, and I think this is a great example, which is that people stopped becoming bartenders and suddenly started to become startenders, right? And so they no longer necessarily worked at any particular place. And by the way, Valentino is an incredible bartender who definitely has done his time, so don't take him personally in this image. But all of a sudden, bartenders recognized that their fame had become separate to the bar that they worked in, connected to, but also a distinct thing in its own right. And brands, of course, needed new stories because, once upon a time it had been very exciting if Simon or Colin or Charlotte turned up in your town, but then after a while they'd been there too often. And so, or they didn't want to make drinks anymore. So they were like, let's get a young startender to come and make drinks. I'll make drinks for the first hour, then they can do like 7 to 2.
Maybe 10 minutes, mate.
Yeah.
Not hour.
Yeah.
Hour?
The thing with this is we've gone through these. If you remember, we were using the term mixologist, right? And then everyone's like, "No, I'm not a mixologist. I'm a bartender." People started hating the term mixologist, but at the time, mixologist actually was used because it gave validation. It was different to a bartender. That's how you could explain it to a consumer. And then everyone hates the term, and then we're bartenders. But then, then we create startenders, and then people hate the term startender, right? And you keep going through those, but let's just face it, we're all fucking bartenders, and that's what it's always going to be. So,
Yeah, I'm still waiting for cocktologist to take off as the term. Yeah.
Hey, you started a trend right here.
Yeah.
You started it. Remember when it happened.
In 2032, we'll be like, remember the rise of the cocktologist? All right. But this, I think, again, we should always put ourselves in the mind of the guest, the consumer, the general public, whatever you want to call them. And for them, this is a lot of fun, right? Going to your bar that you like going to, you love the staff, you love what they do, but all of a sudden, on a Thursday, there's a new bartender making an entirely new set of drinks from a town that you might not have the luxury of going to. And so I think that's the concept of the pop-up and the startender. You can see why it caught on and why it became, something critically important. All right, another macro trend here, and we're going to talk about the Negroni we have in our hands in a second. So the next one would be this kind of once upon a time, bars and restaurants, eating places, drinking places were very distinct from each other. But by the time you get to the late 20-teens, I think it starts to become really, really blurred. So you're going to places that serve drinks are also serving food, and places that serve food are very much trying to up their cocktail game without necessarily wanting to be a restaurant bar or a cocktail bar with snacks. And I think that's kind of something which is really blurring for everyone. And if you're a young bartender thinking about what your concept is for the next few years, do a bit of food and a bit of drinks, and you'll probably make people very, very happy.
I do want to say this is the moment I think this was complete. It happened because chefs were holding out a little bit on bartenders a lot of the time. And now, entry level, you need to have a drinks program. You need to have a cocktail program. And for me, that you can't open a business without it now. And that's what we've achieved. I think that's the moment.
Yeah, there's more of a symbiotic relationship now between bars and the restaurants. And chefs appreciate us a lot more than they ever used to. We used to be those people that would run into their commissaries and steal all of their produce and not pay for it and use it in the bar. But now they appreciate it, and also operators are starting to definitely think about the bar at the same time as they're thinking about a restaurant, which never used to happen before. We were always an afterthought. And a lot of that started with trends that happen here at Tales and us taking each other's our craft seriously. Mm-hmm. And I think there's going to be more to come, and eating and drinking has become, as a symbiotic action, has become more of something that we do. I mean, back in the day when we used to go out drinking, it was just, you either just drank or you just ate. And now we just do both at the same time, which is
well,
awesome.
yeah, and it's also about getting bartenders involved in the design of bars.
That
too, right?
helps.
Which took a long time.
Yeah, it's like, hello.
Big deal. Yeah, that's a great idea.
All right, so then obviously if people are starting to eat more when they're drinking, it's partly driven by sort of the interest in wellness and wanting to kind of moderate and maintain the tempo, which then leads into, oh, sorry, we've got a Negroni here. Sorry, I've forgotten how we wrote these slides. Yeah. Anyway, so this is Naren Young's formula when Naren was at Dante. Naren, thanks for joining us today. So this is, I think, the seminal drink of the late 20-teens, where if everything was an old-fashioned in 2012, by 2017, everything is a Negroni. Negroni and a riff on the Negroni very, very simply. So this is a fairly classic one, moderated for what we would call American strength. So in the rest of the world, Negroni's just equal parts. Here we've got slightly more gin, slightly less of the bitter and the vermouth. But anyway, so that drink came out slightly fast, but thank you again to the CAPS team for putting that together. And Naren, thanks for letting me steal your recipe.
Oh, it's perfect. No, we're just about to say exactly what you're just about to say. Carry on.
All right, so everything by now is a riff on a Negroni. But I wanted to talk, we're just going to go back 1 year slightly because I got these in the wrong order, which is the rise of kind of YOLO and NOLO, which is very much feeds into the food trend. So it seems hard to believe now, but at the end of 2015, I think it was, Seedlip launched as a kind of non-alcoholic adult spirit, designed, more expensive than pretty much anything else in the bar. Thank you, Claire. Well, thank you for kicking off an era of high prices. Yeah. Anyway, and in 2016, it really kind of, people were starting to ask themselves, could there be better drinks that aren't quite so hard on the body, or can low intensity drinks not taste so boring? And I think this has kicked off a really, really important era, which unsurprisingly, 2016 and 2017, most bartenders rejected this idea. I think we were actually behind the general public in this kind of era and ethos. Charlotte, I know you've been very much ahead of this curve, so maybe I'll let you talk about this one.
Well, no, you're right. I think this is a great example of when the consumer or the guest kind of had more to do with the trend perhaps than the bartender community. But it was back in 2018 when our William Grant & Sons portfolio party was spirit free. We did a dry party. And thank you. That was about as many people who agreed with my idea of doing this at the time. Everyone else said, you're crazy, no one's going to come. A lot of people actually got very upset at the idea. But back then I thought, well, if we can't get together as an industry, all joking aside, Simon, I know you're going to come back with something, but if we can't come together as an industry for 3 hours and have a reasonably good time without drinking, we do have bigger issues that we very much have to talk about. We had a great party. Everyone had a good time. I know you're going to tell me that everyone had a flask in their pocket. But it was an important thing to do, I think, at the time. Certainly wasn't the only person thinking of it, but it has become a massive trend and a big part of the future, I think, of our industry.
I actually didn't know there was a greater picture at work. I just thought you'd run out of booze. I thought it was a really good one.
Yeah. I mean, it was a long way ahead of your time, right?
Well, we got Julia Momose to do all of the cocktails, and I think she'll agree as much as anyone. It was a massive learning curve because no one had done drinks like that, as intricate as her cocktails are on such a massive scale. So you can ask Leo and Andy Seymour about the batching for that one. Yeah.
I mean, it was about as popular probably to begin with as, kind of inviting a whole lot of New Orleans chefs to a vegetarian buffet, right? And so there was a lot of kind of pushback initially, but over time it kind of normalized. And I think we're now at a point now where there's an amazing array of offerings and a couple of things, that people should think about. There's still, still naysayers, but at any one point on any given evening, there's more adults in America not drinking tonight than are drinking. Right? Because maybe they've got work tomorrow, maybe they're driving, maybe they're not well. So at any one point, there are more people who'd want an alcohol-free drink than one with alcohol.
I think it's a really important part of hospitality, despite you think that I'm going to make jokes about this, because hospitality is about making everyone welcome. And if you can't make people welcome that don't drink or might need to drink less or have a night off, then you're not making everyone welcome.
Mm-hmm. Yep, great. All right, so 2017, we get to a kind of point, I think, where people start to think about sustainability and the kind of the impact of that the industry is having. And I think this has probably been an interesting one sometimes when the problem it's easy to fix get the right formula for a Tom Collins. Right? That was a problem that we could solve. And ice was a little bit harder, but eventually we shared the information. But this also shows sometimes no matter how much education and information you have, there are problems which are really massive and they're very, very challenging to solve. And sustainability, I think, was one where people were like, great, here's the number one thing I'm going to do is remove straws from my drinks. which I have to say was a great thing. But then, but it was meant to be the start of a kind of a real focus on sustainability. And probably the challenge here is that on both sides of the bar, both bartenders and their guests struggle to get the right level of information and to be able to break the problem down into small chunks. One place that has done an amazing job, this is in Hong Kong, a bar called Penicillin, which is a zero-waste sustainable bar. So we're seeing it happen at single venue opportunities, but for real impact to happen, I think we need to have like all bars and restaurants trying to do some small things rather than a very small number of bars going to 100%. Sorry, Simon.
I actually want to make a very quick comment, not on sorry.
Yep. Thank you.
Another trend, we started naming bars after classic cocktails,
Yes.
Flavor Club. Now we're naming them after modern classics. That's how far we've come. That's 20 years. Penicillin. Sustainability.
Exactly.
No, I was just going to say, like, in the first decade, all of the trends you could literally find in Jerry Thomas's book, like, right? Milk
true.
punch, bottle cocktails, they were literally all there. Now we're getting into trends that are truly of this era.
Yeah, no, that's completely right? So I think, and it's probably a reflection of just how mainstream and how important spirits and cocktails have become to a wider audience. So, the conversations at Tales in 2006, 7, what's the right formula and should it be spelled Boker's Bitters or Bogart's Bitters? And like the general public would be like, I really don't give a shit, and, extremely esoteric conversations that seemed really important at the time. But now we're starting to get, as cocktails have become much more important and spirits are more central to people's lives, we have a responsibility, I think, to solve much bigger problems because cocktails are more mainstream and more everyday. So the formula for how to make the classic original Manhattan is probably still fun to know, but it's not really as central or as important as sustainability and wellness. Cool. Okay, so 2018, a couple of big things happened that felt very, very central, which is Death & Company, which had been a very, very successful bar in its own right in New York City, launched a crowd fund that eventually raised $3 million for them to suddenly open a whole raft of different venues around the country. And in the UK, a venue called London Cocktail Club, which had been very successful, bashing out porn star martinis and kind of like their successor to Lab, they also launched a crowd fund that was so successful that they retired the crowd fund and listed on the London Stock Exchange. So all of a sudden we got to this point where bartenders owning their own bars had gone from like a pipe dream to suddenly becoming not just a single business, but a business empire. A really, really critical moment and one we'd love to see replicated more.
Again, this to me is a magical moment because I think that when I was bartending and when a lot of people started 20 years ago, they were working for, I don't know, a landlord, someone that just opened a place, and you would have bartenders fighting, to get their ideas through, but really it was just about business and quality wasn't thought about. Now the business is the bartenders, and they've opened the bars, and that's really amazing, and that's why another reason why the quality is so much better of the drinks in the world now.
All right, 2019, we start to have conversations that we probably didn't really want to have in the industry. And probably I feel like this was the moment where we started to talk about wellness within the industry. People have been talking about it for a little while, and there have been some early adopters. Charlotte, I know you're much healthier than the rest of us.
I'm an earlier adopter of this movement.
Camille Vidal, who, kind of talking about low and no alcohol and bartenders taking care of themselves. But I think 2019 was the point at which it started to become really central to everything that was happening. Every bar show, every brand programming, and it was long overdue. And unfortunately, the trigger for it really was we had lots of bartenders we knew and loved who weren't with us anymore. And so I think this is something that, that was a really, really central part, and we hope that we continue to find the space to talk about it. All right, we're going to keep clicking through because this is an incredibly important, uncomfortable conversation. It didn't necessarily happen at Tales, but has been reflected at Tales. So obviously, 2020, all of a sudden, we're all stuck at home watching news unfold on our laptop. And in June 2020, we have the kind of horrific murder of George Floyd, which kind of acts as a trigger. And people suddenly realize, I think because everyone is, nobody can avoid seeing things anymore. And all of a sudden, I think it reaches a trigger point in our industry as well for us to have conversations that we'd really been avoiding for a very long time. Yeah. Colin, I should probably start with you here, because I know you got some thoughts on this topic.
Yeah, I've just got a few thoughts. Just to preface this conversation by, this is not uncomfortable conversations about Tiffany Berry, eh?
No.
Just so we know. We all love her and appreciate her, and we should give her a round of applause for where she's come in the industry. But the crazy thing is, we actually had a social awakening within the industry in 2017 when the previous owners did something that we all know. They painted themselves blackface, which was something which was derogatory to African Americans and black people in this country. So, of course, they paid their price. They're no longer with us. And we as a community have moved on, and we're trying to be as inclusive as ever. And I think, thank you.
Yep.
And much like when Speed Rack started, and there weren't, people said there weren't a lot of women in the industry. There's a big movement to become more inclusive with LGBTQ plus bartenders and much more diversity, African Americans within your bars, within management positions as well. And it's not a matter of tokenism. I think what's happening within the industry is things are becoming more, as we move forward, things are becoming more intentional. We at Bacardi, for example, we have very intentionally developed a division, a multicultural and LGBTQ plus division. We have a belonging division as well, which listens to all the communities within our business to understand them, to ensure that everyone gets a fair crack of the whip and there's a level playing field. And I think a lot of those trends and those conversations started here at Tails. If you look around now, when I first came, I mean, I think I was one of 5 black people at Tails, and myself and Ian Burrell and Clyde Davis used to go, hang on a minute, what's happening here? How are we going to make a change? But over time, it's grown. There's a lot more representation, which is amazing. And uncomfortable conversations are great for us to have, because it basically gives everyone some kind of understanding of where people come from. It helps you understand things that you may have taken for granted in the past. And I really believe that Tails as an institution, all of us as a cocktail community, are really going to make all the changes that we really want to see.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, thank you for reminding us about Tiffany, because the reason she's there is not because we need to have uncomfortable conversations about her, but the amazing work that she's been doing actually in choosing the moments, the fact that people were sitting at home watching about cocktails on Zoom and shining a light on the very, very overlooked, sometimes unintentionally, but quite often intentionally obscured contribution of black bartenders and black distillers to the amazing cocktail heritage that we're all lucky enough to enjoy. So she's definitely somebody you should follow and definitely somebody you should find. And she also did perhaps one of the best examples of a big trend for 2020, 2021, which was delivering cocktail education and training in classes online. Absolutely amazing opportunity. And I think, this has been a really, really good and promising kind of development, which was, for a while, if you had said that bartenders, what we're going to teach people about cocktails over Zoom, that would have seemed incredibly boring, because what was the point, right?
No, but people would have said, what was Zoom?
Well, that's that's right. But all of a sudden, it gave people a shared community to be doing a shared experience and connecting together, even if you were disparate around the world. But it also gave people, again, this idea of the long tail, who had a very, very specific point of view about cocktails, the ability to get that message out to a wider audience. And it's also provided, I think, a very useful and much needed kind of stream of income for bars, bartenders, brands, whatever it is, over the last 2 years.
This is like one big Zoom screen to me. Everyone's there, but I can't go off camera.
Oh, there's the gallery.
And we can't put you on mute. Yeah.
I set that up, didn't I?
All right, so now we get to 2022, and everything has come round in circles. And now everything, when we started, everything was an RTD, and now everything is a cocktail, but in an RTD. So, but now let's talk about where we're going from here. So a couple of things, like how do we grow this industry? So we're in an amazing point now where people now spend more on spirits and cocktails than they do on beer or wine. It's now the biggest single driver of growth in the on-premise, which is a pretty amazing point. But how do we continue this amazing momentum? So Charlotte, I know this is a really important point for you, this idea of informed and educated guests.
Well, I think just in general, more people are deciding the trends for the future, right? Whether it's the guests, whether it's the larger platform we've helped grow for all different communities within the industry. There's just a lot more people invested and with influence who are driving what's going to happen in the future. For a while there, it was the same kind of small group of people that were geeking out, and then eventually something happened 10 years later. Now it's happening faster, and a lot more people have a say. So I probably shouldn't and don't know the answer to what's going to happen in the future, because it's no longer up to me.
Yeah. So what we've got now, I think, is a very, we've always had enthusiasts, but now we have a much wider audience who get their insight and advice from people like Sandre and Gary, the cocktail lovers who are here on screen, who do an amazing job popularizing drinks trends in London. And every city has got a couple of people like that. And if you're in the bar and restaurant business, you should find them and look after them and make sure that they're doing a great job in growing your industry and growing your scene, because knowledge leads to appreciation, which is one of the earliest points. So a small amount of knowledge will drive a lot of enthusiasm. And so you've got people like this in every city in the world. Make sure you find them and look after them. Cool. Next one, velocity, which is something, everything is moving faster at much more incredible speeds. And eventually, as this shows, in a year's time, everything will be a paper plane, which is a great example of a cocktail that in 2020, nobody really knew about, and then all of a sudden it became this it was a drink that took off among home bartending enthusiasts. It had always been a bartender handshake, right? Much like the penicillin had started out, but all of a sudden within 12 months, it was everywhere in online conversations and TikTok, whatever that is. And so everything is moving much, much faster. So you also need to make sure that if you run a bar, you run a restaurant, you need to have young staff that are savvy and understand, where is the information coming from? Where are the trends coming from? Because very soon it won't be coming from us, if it ever did. And so you need to make sure, have you got young staff and are you plugged in to asking them, what are people talking about online? Because the current generation of drinkers want things to happen much more quickly, and they want to have a much stronger say in what are the popular cocktails over the next little while. We've seen this again with, the boom of agave spirits all of a sudden over the last 2 years. Which then leads to the next one, which is a much more diverse, basically kind of audience of drinkers want to expect to see a much more diverse workforce looking after them and serving them. Basically, people who drink, or maybe even don't drink, right, want to see people who look like them making drinks. And so this is a really, really important point. We're only just getting started when we talk about diversity in the conversations around the bar, the people we use in advertising, the people you should be looking to hire. And this is going to, I think, be a seismic change over the next 5 to 10 years. The people who work behind the bar and the people who come into the bar are going to look unrecognizably different. And that's a good thing, because they'll look like America. And they'll look like every city in the world. The people who drink cocktails will look like the wider population. And that means that your staff need to as well.
Yeah, I just want to add as well, for the first time as well in Tales history, this year we're doing the first inaugural Pride Gala at Oz. And this is driven by Chris Cabrera, who's very much part of the LGBTQ plus community. And also the support of all of us. This event's going to be amazing and be hopefully something that will get replicated in other cities and at Tales in the coming years.
Yeah, totally. So Colin, as we often say at Tales, can you get me on the list?
Oh, it's a tough one. Of course I can, bruv.
All right. And then finally, perhaps the other kind of point as well, we talk about sustainability a lot, but perhaps a really important thing over the next 2 to 3 years is trying to rework the industry business model. So how do we make a more sustainable, financially sustainable business model in terms of more financially savvy people working behind the bar, operating bars, understanding their business, and how can we make sure that bars and bartenders are able to share in the amazing growth, the 103% growth in the on-trade of spirits and cocktails that you have all played such a massive part in having. And I think that's another one of the really important conversations for us for the next couple of years. So, guys, any final thoughts in the couple of minutes that we have left? What are we going to be drinking in 2032? Gin. Yeah, finally. Gin could finally have its moment. Yeah. Well, I think the answer, obviously, at least in the numbers, is agave. Yeah. So, which is going to, eventually we're all going to have to move to Mexico and work as humidors, because the demand for tequila is going to become so overwhelming.
As I've often said, the future's Africa. I'm just saying.
Or so is the past.
Exactly, and so is the past. Thank you very much. I really believe you're going to get so many more spirits coming from that continent that you haven't heard of first. If you haven't heard of a lot of African spirits, there are a lot of them actually in the new encyclopedia that's out, which I saw at Petache and Agoragora and all these other amazing spirits that you're looking at me like, what did he just say? That you'll find, and they're coming out. They're getting distribution in the US, so I think you're going to see those as the next bartenders' handshakes at Tales in the years to come.
Great.
I want to add to what Colin just said on that front. We were just visiting bars in Nairobi, and what?
It made me climb out a mountain. Humidity. It was awful.
I took him to a bar afterwards, redeemed.
Took me to a bar after. It was great.
So you know, but we're visiting the bartenders, and there's different, you know, dollars go further. Americans make more money. If you're in Europe, you make more money. If you're bartending in lots of, you know, parts of other parts of the world, you might make $200, $400, $500, right, a month. You know, and that's what we were hearing. So if you work with brands, and you're bringing bartenders from around the world, think of the bartenders that can't quite afford to be at Tales. You know, like, let's start spreading spread the wealth, right, to everybody, and bring them here at Tales, so that we can have more of it here and hear ideas. Because they were brilliant. The people we met behind the bars, everywhere we went, were as good, and they just don't get the recognition.
We were at a hero bar, and that bar was amazing. I mean, the cocktail menu alone was as good as somewhere you'd see at Undertow in Arizona or anywhere in the US.
And if I'm correct, it's the only bar in Africa that's currently on the world's 50 best, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So we need more bars from all over the world, more geographical representation.
Charlotte, any last thoughts from you?
I don't really want to follow that, so.
Yeah.
All good.
All right,
There will
well,
be booze at the William Grant party this year. I just want to confirm that for everyone.
Oh, just before we do finish, I just want to find out. Raise your hands. Who's the first Tales? Who's been here? Oh, give yourselves a round of applause to come in. And hopefully it won't be your last.
Yeah. Yeah, so I want to make a couple of massive thank yous. First to Patrick, to Jonathan, and the rest of the CAPS team for producing extraordinary cocktails in challenging circumstances. Thanks to all of the Tales committees, the Education Committee. Thank you to our three amazing panelists, Charlotte Boise, Colin Cesare Appia, Simon Ford. And finally, thank you to our sponsor, Bombay Sapphire. Thank you all so much. We'll see you at Tales 2032.